So picture this: a factory floor, humming with machines, workers doing their thing, everything looking perfectly normal. And yet, somewhere in that ordinary-looking day, a tiny decision gets made that ends up costing a company millions of dollars. No explosion, no fire, just a mistake so small that almost nobody noticed it happening. That is the wild part about manufacturing errors. They rarely look dramatic in the moment. There is no alarm blaring, no red flashing lights. Just a slightly wrong measurement, a missed step, a part that does not quite fit the way it should, and by the time anyone realizes what happened, the damage is already baked into thousands, sometimes millions, of units. Today we are diving into one of those stories, a mistake that seems so minor on paper but ended up snowballing into a financial disaster. We are talking recalls, lawsuits, destroyed reputations, and a bill that ran into the millions. And the craziest part, the actual error at the center of it all, was almost embarrassingly simple. Let me set the scene. This happened at a company that manufactured components for a much larger product, something that gets used by tons of people every single day. Now, I am not going to bore you with a corporate history lesson, but you need to understand the pressure this company was under. They had deadlines. They had competitors breathing down their neck. They had a supply chain that needed to move fast, or customers would go elsewhere. So speed became the priority. And when speed becomes the priority, quality control sometimes gets treated like an afterthought. Not because anyone wanted it to fail, but because everyone assumed someone else was double-checking things. That assumption right there is where this whole disaster starts to take shape. Here is the actual mistake. During production, a critical measurement on a component was set incorrectly. We are talking about a tolerance that was off by a tiny fraction, something so small you would need specialized tools just to detect it with the naked eye. In everyday terms, imagine baking a cake and using a teaspoon of salt instead of a tablespoon. Doesn't sound catastrophic, right? But multiply that tiny error across an entire batch, then multiply that batch across months of production, and suddenly you have thousands of defective units sitting in warehouses, trucks, and store shelves. The scary part is how normal everything looked while this was happening. Workers were following the instructions they were given. Machines were operating exactly as programmed. Nothing seemed off. The problem wasn't a machine malfunctioning or a worker being careless. The problem was baked into the actual specifications that got handed down the line. Someone somewhere approved a measurement that was wrong, and once that happened, everything downstream simply followed orders. This is honestly one of the scariest things about large-scale manufacturing. Machines do exactly what they are told. If the instructions are flawed, the machines will happily produce a flawless execution of a flawed idea. There is no built-in common sense that says, wait, this doesn't seem right. It just keeps stamping out identical pieces, hour after hour, day after day. So for weeks, maybe even months, this error kept multiplying. Every single unit that rolled off the line carried the same tiny flaw. And because the flaw was so subtle, quality checks kept passing it through. The people doing spot checks weren't specifically looking for this exact issue, because nobody knew it existed yet. It's like trying to find a typo in a book when you don't even know which word is misspelled. Eventually, the problem started to surface, but not in the way you might expect. It didn't show up on a factory inspection sheet. It showed up out in the real world, with real customers. Using the actual product, some units started failing. Not in a wildly dramatic way at first, just some unusual reports here and there. A part not fitting quite right, a component wearing out faster than expected. Little things that on their own seemed like isolated incidents. But here's the thing about small, isolated incidents. When you're producing at a massive scale, isolated incidents start adding up fast. What began as a handful of complaints slowly grew into a noticeable pattern. Customer service started getting more calls. Retailers started sending back defective units. And engineers, the ones who actually understood the technical side, started getting pulled in to investigate. This is where things get really interesting, because figuring out the root cause wasn't instant. It took time. Engineers had to pull apart returned units, compare them to the original design specs, and slowly trace the problem back through the entire manufacturing process. It's kind of like detective work, except instead of solving a crime, you're solving why thousands of identical objects are quietly failing in the same weird way. And when they finally traced it back, that's when the gut punch hit. The issue wasn't a one-time fluke. It wasn't a random batch that got messed up. It was baked into the actual production specifications that had been used from the very beginning of this manufacturing run, which meant every single unit made under those specs had the same underlying flaw. Let that sink in for a second. This wasn't a problem you could fix by pulling one bad batch off the shelf. This was systemic. Every unit produced during that window was potentially affected, and when you're dealing with mass production, that number can balloon into the hundreds of thousands, sometimes millions, of units. Once the company realized the scale of the problem, they were faced with a brutal decision. Do they quietly try to patch things and hope it doesn't get worse? Or do they come clean, admit the mistake, and initiate a massive recall? Spoiler alert, trying to hide manufacturing mistakes almost never works out well in the long run. Eventually, the truth comes out, and when it does, it tends to come out messier and more expensive than if the company had just been upfront from the start. So the recall process began. And let me tell you, recalls are financially brutal. You're not just eating the cost of the original defective units. You're paying to identify every single affected product, notify customers, arrange returns or repairs, and often replace units entirely. Multiply that by the sheer volume of units produced, and you start to see how a tiny measurement error suddenly turns into a multi-million-dollar nightmare. But the direct cost of the recall itself is honestly just the tip of the iceberg. There's also the cost of halting production while the company investigates and fixes the actual root cause. Every hour that a manufacturing line sits idle is money lost. Multiply that across the time it takes to properly diagnose the issue, adjust manufacturing specs, retrain staff, and restart production safely, and you're looking at massive operational costs stacking on top of the recall expenses. Then there's the reputational damage, which honestly might be the most expensive part of all, even if it doesn't show up as a single line item on a balance sheet. Once customers hear that a company shipped out defective products, trust takes a serious hit. People start second-guessing whether they want to buy from that brand again. Retailers get more cautious about stocking their products. Competitors happily swoop in to capture nervous customers looking for alternatives. And here's the thing about trust. It's incredibly slow to rebuild. A company can spend years cultivating a strong reputation, and a single manufacturing mistake, if handled poorly, can chip away at that reputation in a matter of weeks. Marketing teams then have to work overtime trying to convince the public that quality control has been fixed, that this won't happen again, that the brand is still reliable. That kind of reputation repair campaign costs serious money too, on top of everything else. Lawsuits are another layer to this financial mess. When defective products cause damage, whether that's to property, other equipment, or in worst cases, personal injury, customers and businesses affected by the faulty units often pursue legal action. Legal battles are slow, expensive, and unpredictable. Settlements can range from moderate to absolutely massive depending on the severity of the harm caused. And even if a company eventually wins a lawsuit, the legal fees alone can rack up into serious money over the course of a drawn-out case. So when you start stacking all of this together, the recall costs, the halted production, the reputation damage, the marketing campaigns needed to rebuild trust, and the potential lawsuits, you start to understand how a measurement error that seemed almost invisible on paper ballooned into a financial disaster worth millions of dollars. Now here's a question that probably popped into your head. How does something like this even happen in the first place? Don't companies have quality control specifically designed to catch this kind of thing? And the honest answer is yes, they do. But quality control systems are only as good as the assumptions built into them. In this case, The flaw wasn't something quality control was actively looking for, because nobody suspected that specific measurement was wrong. Quality control tends to check for known risks, things that have caused problems before, or things flagged as high priority during the design process. But when an error slips into the actual specifications during the design or engineering phase, standard quality checks downstream might not catch it because they're checking if production matches the spec, not whether the spec itself is correct. This is honestly one of the trickiest parts of manufacturing. Everyone downstream trusts